All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Soda Mesa, the show that aims to break down the formal barrier between students and professors by conversing with a different faculty member each week about their personal interests, research in their respective field of study, current events, among other interesting topics, all while enjoying from a different dessert every week. My name is Ruben Maya. With me is my friend and co-host Jay Clore.
Good morning.
And with us today is Professor Aaron Retish.
Nice to be here.
Remember to send us by text any questions you may have for Professor Retish through our show to 313-451-2909. We will read the questions towards the end of the show. So, Professor Retish, how about we start out by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your areas of study here at Wayne State?
Right. So I have been at Wayne State since 2003, so 15 years, 14 and a half years. And I study Russian history, mostly the 19th and 20th century. So my focus is 1861 to 1929. And I focus on the peasantry and the Russian Revolution. And right now I'm completing a book on local courts and how peasants used the courts in the Soviet Union. So, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I think so.
So one of the big things that I think of, the time period that you mentioned, 1860 to 1920, there's something big that happened there towards the end.
So there are a bunch of things. So there's, 1861 is the emancipation of the serfs in Russia. So the serfs were freed from bondage, and then then there's a struggle over land. But then it goes, obviously, there's the Russian Revolution in 1917. And then Stalin coming to power in around 1929, and then collectivization. So, yeah, I get to hit them all. But, I should say I teach, for my Russian history, I teach the cooling of the mantle to the present. So my research focus is just that, it's focused, but I have kind of a broader interest. So, yeah.
When you say the cooling of the mantle, is that the mantle of the planet?
I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek. I haven't actually taught it in a few years, but I do have kind of Russia to the revolution to 1917. So we talk about kind of the formation of the geography of Russia, the peoples that initially inhabited the lands. I guess I don't really talk about dinosaurs or saber-toothed tigers or anything. So,
Do you ever teach? Do you speak Russian?
Yeah.
Do you ever teach a class in full
Russian?
No.
No. I mean, for several reasons. No. I'll leave that up to my great colleagues in the Russian department. And I never have. You don't need to have Russian to take my classes.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I try to throw in some good Russian phrases or some, I don't know. Yeah. So it's no, I never have them learn Russian.
What got you into this?
That's a good question. There are a couple of things. So my grandparents, great-grandparents are from Western Russia, from present-day Moldova, and around Chisinau, and then down to Odessa, which is in the south, in Ukraine. And so there is this family lineage, but also growing up, I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s. And I mean, it's kind of interesting because I delivered newspapers as a kid, right, for a couple of years. That's what a lot of kids used to do. I grew up in Iowa. So in the cornfield of Iowa, I would get up every morning at 5:15 and go deliver the Des Moines Register, and I would read the headlines every day. So it was mostly kind of Reagan, and every day I was following the heating up of the Cold War and Reagan talking about the evil empire, which piqued my interest. Who are these people who we're supposed to hate? Who are these Russians? So that kind of got me interested in studying Russia and then studying the revolution in particular, because this was the turning point, right, of when the Russians decided to become evil, right, to actually become communist. So that's what kind of got my interest going. Then I read a lot as a high school student, not only Russian history, but also about communism. And then I just had a couple of really great teachers in college at the University of Wisconsin. The Russian historian there was just smart as heck, and he just showed how complex Russian history was. And I'm still confused about half of the things that he said, but I mean, I love it. I just absolutely loved it. And then my junior year, which was 1991 to 1992, I was studying abroad in England, and I had this great year-long course in the Russian Revolution where we read documents and we kind of did this primary document. We did this textual analysis of the Russian Revolution, kind of almost following it day by day. And my mind was just blown about kind of how complex and kind of the multi-layers of the Russian Revolution. And then there was this opportunity to go to Russia for, I forget what it was, 2 weeks. And this was the Soviet Union. So I signed up to go to the Soviet Union in 1991. And I was going to go in February of 1992. Well, in December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. So I signed up to go to a country that I ended up going to that no longer existed. And so I was there in Russia in 1992. I went to St. Petersburg. At that time, it was Leningrad and Moscow. And, I wish that I had the knowledge today to understand what I actually saw then, because it was surreal. Not only were kind of there the vestiges of communism there, but just the bread lines, the people lining up on the streets trying to sell homemade objects just to have a meal. So I saw that while also visiting Lenin's tomb and, the Lenin Museum. And, after that I was hooked. So I learned Russian. I went to graduate school at, if I can say, Ohio State. I don't know if you throw me off the air here.
Big Wayne State rival.
Oh, yes, that's true. And the rest is history. So, that's it.
The period in the 90s, was it called the Wild 90s? I've heard that term.
The Dikia. Kind of the wild, and it really was crazy. I talked about the lines for bread and the selling of household objects, but just the loss of, there was not much respect for the law, and it was just really nuts.
Did anything strange happen to you personally?
Yeah. So in the 90s, I was there in 96, and then, so I was there in, obviously in 92, I was there in 96, or was it 97, and then 99 to 2001. So let's see, I was there for a couple of times during the terrorist attacks in Moscow. There were, so 92, actually. So this is how I was introduced to Leningrad. I was driving in from the airport, which at that time was it kind of looked like a small city airport where you kind of walked in and then walked right out in the street. And then I got in this car and we were driving into the center of the city. And so they had trams. They still have trams that were on rails. I was driving down, and there were 10 guys trying to push this tram back on the rails because it had fallen off, because the infrastructure had collapsed. And that was my introduction to Russia. There were also a lot of suicides that year, people jumping in front of metros. So then, other crazy things that I can say on the air.
You can say really anything.
So when I spent most of my time in the provinces, in the north, in the northeast, a place called Kirov, and I had the craziest landlord there. This doesn't really have anything to do about the wild 1990s. I think he was just nuts, and he was drunk. He had a serious drinking problem. And so I know that he was using my rent to basically get himself drunk. But beyond that, he made his living as a spiritual healer. And so I got this ear infection, and I couldn't go to the doctor. I was having problems finding a doctor, and the doctor who I'd actually found, who I was going to able to pay in dollars, wasn't available. So he came over and tried to take the evil spirits out of my ear. And it didn't work, so I ended up having to go to another. I ended up going to this doctor. It was great. This it's kind of that classic image of the doctor with the big mirror, right? For that you see in the 1950s. So she had one of those, and yeah, she healed me. She healed me using modern medicine. Yeah, those aren't the best. Crazy. I'm sure I'll think. I mean, I drank moonshine in a hut. That was kind of neat, and I'm able to tell about it. Live to tell about it. There were these. Yeah. I'll leave it there.
So how much time did you spend in Russia?
So the largest time I was there, the longest time I was there was I kind of these off and on for 2 years when I was doing my research for my first book. When I was when I was a graduate student writing my dissertation. Then I went back in 2004, and then when I was doing that was kind of the longest block of time. Then I've gone off and on since basically 2009 to today. In kind of these stints, I have a family, so it's kind of hard to, and I teach, so it's kind of hard to get these longer stints to really kind of sink back into Russian culture. Yeah, and now it's the visas. There are some stronger regulations about visas, but which is kind of making it harder. So yeah, I strongly recommend anyone who's listening to this to go to Russia. It's awesome. It's the Russians are wonderful. Russia itself is just a beautiful country.
If I went to Russia, what would be like the must-try thing to do?
I think you got to get your spirits, demons removed from your ear.
Yeah, maybe that's the
a
first
spiritual
thing.
doctor.
Well, I encourage people to get outside the capital, to get outside of Moscow, to get outside of St. Petersburg and actually experience Russia. That Moscow, and this is what, so Moscow and St. Petersburg are supposed to be the hearts of Russia, especially Moscow. But to really kind of understand Russians and Russia, you got to go into the provinces. The Russians like to say that Moscow, the roads of Moscow are lined in gold, because all the resources go to Moscow. So if you go to Moscow, you think, wow, the Russians are doing really well. Everyone's wealthy. That's in the center of Moscow. But then when you get out to the provinces, you see poverty, but more importantly, you kind of get the spirit of Russia. The churches, but also the food and clothing, the ambiance. Yeah, so that's not really the one thing. I can give you a laundry list of things to do in Moscow. I love going to visit Lenin just because it's kind of a bizarre relic of the past, and seeing the Kremlin Wall. I love going to Red Square. I love going to the Moscow River, going to the museums, just walking around. I love eating anywhere I can. In Moscow, and sometimes you get really sick, so whenever I go there, I try to fill up on a couple of, there are these blini, which are kind of like pancakes, I guess, very like crepes, but better. It's kind of the Russian cuisine, Russian kind of national cuisine, and those are just delicious. But yeah, mostly walking around and experiencing Russia. For me as a historian, I love to go to the archives and libraries, but if you were a tourist, I would not recommend that.
Okay.
It might be a little boring.
Why is it that Moscow has all the wealth? Is it corruption, or is it some sort of propaganda?
Well, no, it's centralization. That Russia historically is a very centralized state, and so a lot of, if you see it like if if you can see this on the radio, it's kind of like a sieve, right? So everything kind of goes to the center. A funnel. Thank you. That's what I'm looking for. So a lot of the reason, because that's where the central government is, and then then they kind of disperse it to the provinces. But this is one of those things that's traditionally been that way. It was there under the Tsars, and it's continued under the Soviets and the post-Soviet regime. So there's this real imbalance of standard of living. Yeah.
I think I was reading the other day that most of the billionaires in the world live in Moscow.
I'm not surprised. Yeah.
That I think there's like 30 of them that live in Moscow, and it's like 2 more than New York City.
Yeah, that could
Something
be.
like that I was reading. Yeah.
Yeah, and those, the Russian oligarchs, which came from the 1990s, and kind of this control of most of the larger, as controlled by one man, because they're almost all men, controlling kind of natural resources or what we would see as kind of the large state industries. Yeah, and you see that flaunted in Moscow. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you try out the Trans-Siberian Railway?
No, I've never done the Trans-Siberian. So I've always wanted to. The place that I study, Kirov, is there are 2 ways to get on the Trans-Siberian. You can go through Kirov, so that is I'm kind of partway through, or most of the time you go south. So no, I've never done it. You should. You can actually start from, I think you can start in Berlin or something, go all the way out to China.
Yeah,
so.
I think it takes like 150 hours, something like that.
Yeah, it could be. So there's train culture, and you're talking about things that you should experience. Train culture is one of the things that you should experience in Russia, because there is a distinct culture that's grown from this, where, so there are different levels, right? I guess you have first class, second class, third class here in the States as well. So if you get kind of the second class, you're on kind of these overnight trains. You're in a compartment with 3 people, and that leads to wonderful stories. And so when you get your ticket, that you then pay a couple additional rubles. I think it's about $1.50 extra. You get sheets and a blanket, and so you make your own bed, and then you wear. So they're the East European traditions that you don't wear your shoes in the house, which makes sense, so that you don't spread dirt. So when you're in the train compartment, you're also supposed to wear slippers. You're not supposed to wear your shoes. And then there is someone who comes and collects tickets, but then they also just kind of watch over the passengers. They serve you tea from samovar, which is a heated kettle at the end of the car. And the idea of the train is that it's supposed to be a little bit more cultured, a little bit more refined, that you're not supposed to be uncultured. The word in Russian is nekulturny. And it's just, there's a wonderful element to kind of this Victorian culture, if you will, of taking the train. But that's a long answer. No, I've never done the Trans-Siberian, but I've done a lot of overnight train rides, and it's a blast. Yeah.
Is it kind of like when in the 50s people would take a plane in the US, they dress up?
Yeah, I guess. Although I don't know. So when you dress up, you don't dress up. You actually wear comfortable clothing to sleep in. So yeah. So it's not that you're wearing ties or anything.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It's great.
You ever listen to the band Trans-Siberian Orchestra?
No. No. Have you?
Yeah, a little bit. Have you?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Maybe we can close with a song from Trans-Siberian Orchestra.
So what does your family think about your fixation with Russia?
Like my parents or my kids?
Your kids.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, that goes back and forth. So I took my family over a couple years ago. It's been too long, like 5 or 6 years ago, just to give them a sense of what I was doing. And we got them, my wife and I were able to get them to enjoy it, I think, by plying them with a lot of candy and little toys. So when they were there, they loved it. And Yeah, but my larger fixation with Russia, I don't think that they understand. When they were kids, I got them all of these Russian alphabet books, and I tried to get them kind of to love Russia, and I read them folk stories, and nothing stuck. So that was very disappointing. Recently, I've been telling my son kind of the bloodiest encounters that I could think of in Russian history and in the work that I'm doing, and he seemed to really like that.
Okay.
But Russian history has not yet. Yeah, I'm still waiting. I'm crossing my fingers, and hopefully we can get them back over there. Yeah, at one point when I was going over a lot, my kids said, actually I forget if my son or daughter said that they hated Russia. So that's that's the closest they've ever come to say that they hate me. So I don't know. They live with it. They know that I like to think about it and talk about it. And they know, they're one of the few kids in the area, I think, who can say they can identify who Lenin is and they know who Putin is. So, I give them, there's something. They know who Lenin's wife was and that he's a group's guy. So that's, I give them that. Yeah.
When you were learning the language, what was the hardest part for you, if there was any difficulties?
Russian is just you never stop learning Russian. And even Russians will say about the people who I study, peasants, they say, oh, they don't even know Russian. Because, again, there's kind of the educated Russian, and then there's the Russian spoken by peasants, which is filled with grammatical mistakes, and kind of colloquial phrases. The hardest thing, the first couple of years are pretty straightforward. It's learning, I don't know, I've always struggled with instrumental case, and yeah, that's been a challenge.
Well, they have a different alphabet, right?
Completely different alphabet, but you know what? The alphabet is, for all the people trying to learn Russian out there, the alphabet is really, really easy.
Okay.
It's just like I learned the alphabet by walking up and down at Wisconsin. All the fraternities and sororities were on one street, and when I could recognize all the Greek letters, I was halfway through the Cyrillic alphabet because there's such a similarity, right? Because they adopted the letters. So that's not a problem. And things are spelled more or less phonetically, so spelling isn't that much of an issue. Yeah, some of the colloquialisms, as you have here too, they're just hard to pick up, especially colloquialisms done the countryside 100 years ago.
Right.
So, yeah. Yeah.
I studied a little bit of the Russian alphabet.
Yeah.
Have you heard of an app called Tinder?
Yes.
Okay, so it has this feature you can put your location anywhere in the world, and I decided, hey, I'm going to put it in Russia.
Oh.
But all the women's names were in Russian.
Right.
So I kind of just picked it up that way.
Oh, good. So where in Russia did you say that you were?
Oh,
I didn't know that Russia actually had Tinder.
It wasn't as many people as here, I don't think. Okay. But I put it in like Southwest, I guess.
Neat.
So near the bigger cities, right?
There are some big cities in the Southwest. Voronezh, Rostov-na-Donu. Yeah, it's kind of towards the south. That's nice. That's a great way of learning Russian. I never thought about that.
It's not very academic.
He does that with every country. So what's one thing, when you went to Russia, what's one thing that you would take from, I guess, the Russian government and you would bring it to the U.S. and implement it here? What's one thing that would work here?
In present-day Russia?
Yeah.
Oh, God. I was going to say nothing. The Russian government. That is a hard one.
What about historically? Is there anything?
Well, I guess, so there is this tradition of petition writing, and where anyone from the lowliest peasant up writes a petition, a letter to their, even up to the highest, up to Putin, to Yeltsin, to Lenin, with the expectation that they will receive an answer. And there's always an expectation that if they can write to the top, so there's this idea that it's this traditional myth that the czar or whoever, president, is pure and right, and the only reason why they're not doing just acts is because they're surrounded by evil nobles, evil boyars, evil bureaucrats. So there's this tradition of letter writing and petition writing, and oftentimes there is a response, and there is this sense at the center, at the top, that they have a responsibility to answer. That doesn't mean always do. And I think that kind of back and forth is really good. Historically, Russia there's this idea in the news that Russia has this autocratic tradition, that they are authoritarian, anti-democratic, and that there's nothing farther from the truth, that Russia actually has a really long tradition of democracy, going back to the medieval times of Lord Novgorod the Great. Obviously, the Russian Revolution in February of 1917 was a democratic revolution, and the provisional government, the 1917 government itself, was revolutionary in its ideas, really forward-thinking. A lot of the Soviet ideas from the 1920s were great and emancipatory, especially for women, for national minorities, for workers, for students, God forbid, that they actually got a lot of political say, they got economic say. So it's not really answering the question about what you get from the government, but there is a long history in Russia of revolution, but also from grassroots, the power of the grassroots. And that's a really important message. So,
as you said, our perception, most Americans have the perception that Russia's been pretty authoritarian.
Yeah.
Was that something that was just sold to us by
propaganda?
Or was
well, there's a Russophobia that kind of dominates American news. I think propagated by both the left and the right, and this goes back actually from before 1917, before the Communist Revolution. The ideas of especially in the European media, the Western media, that the Russian bear is going to try to swallow all of Europe, but then took an ideological hue during the Soviet Union. The idea of the evil empire, or the idea that Russians are somehow either inherently evil, inherently authoritarian based on their nature, or that communism itself is kind of crushing them. And these became easy tropes, easy images for Americans to consume. So when a lot of the news reports go back to these ideas, right? When they talk about Putin only as a KGB agent, when they say on the news, which they often say, oh, well, they are just reviving or carrying on a Soviet policy. These are just, they're tried and true, uncreative.
Pretty simplified, too.
Simplified, yeah, that's exactly it. I forget what the question is. But yes, so that's kind of, that's, you see it in the media all the time.
Yeah, it seems like we're trying to explain something that most people don't really know a lot about. And you
Yeah.
kind of just get a simple view.
Right. And, it's in a multipolar world, it's people kind of try to find an enemy. In no way am I saying that a lot of Putin's policies are somehow democratic or I disagree with a lot of the Russian government, but I think we need to understand the complexities of the relationships. That, the wall collapsed, the communism in the Soviet Union collapsed in '91, and a lot has happened since then. So.
What do you think about the recent allegations from Russia meddling in the 2016 election? Have we seen something from Russia in the past meddling with other people's elections?
Yes, yeah. This is one of their things. This is one of their modus operandi to do. Yes. So there's an interesting. Meddling itself is an interesting word to use because when I hear the word meddle, it's to kind of intervene in something that's not really your concern. And that part is true, but it's, from what I've seen, they were doing, a little bit more than meddling, right? This is conscious, I don't want to use the word sabotage, but this is conscious kind of intervention. There has been a history of Russian meddling, intervention in other countries' politics. Ukraine is the best case. Lithuania, France, they did some stuff. Georgia, etc. So the Russians would counter. Well, they would counter in two ways. One, that they didn't do it, which is fine. That could be. It could also be. It's pretty clear they did. But there could also be corporations that did it as well. But they would also say that they are not alone in intervening in elections.
Right.
And they would specifically point to the United States intervening in Russian politics, meddling in Russian politics. One in 1996, when Boris Yeltsin, who was president of Russia, was on his way to losing to the communist candidate, Gennady Zyuganov at the time, and the United States basically came in, or some people who had been working for the United States government came in and basically rescued the Yeltsin campaign by intervening in the elections, right? That's one time. Then more recently, they point to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, speaking out in favor of the protests against Putin, and then speaking out against Russian elections. And they would say, well, look, the United States has been doing this. Why can't we?
Right.
So it's this context that's really important. So there's this great case of where it's not just the Soviet experience, but it's in fact post-Soviet that has shaped Russian governmental policy.
One of our previous guests, Dr. Pearson, also from your history department.
He's from Peace and Conflict.
Oh, he's from Peace and Conflict?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, misspoke.
That's right.
Another previous guest.
Yeah.
That's from history. He told us to ask you about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Yes.
That kind of seems. Was that some type of meddling?
Okay, so the Abraham Lincoln Brigade is something that all your listeners should be aware of, especially at Wayne State. So the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was a group of activists who, in the 1930s, Spain had a civil war where there was a Republican government, and there was a coup by the military and by fascists led by Franco, and that resulted. The coup failed, but it led to a civil war, and there was this really interesting. The Spanish Civil War is really important to the 20th century because it's actually the real beginning of World War II in Europe. And there was a decision made by almost all the powers not to intervene to fight fascism in Spain. That Roosevelt, Blum in France, decided not to support the anti-fascists.
Why was that?
There was a sense of non-intervention. That was the one thing, was that there was a feeling that they didn't want to intervene, to upset the international order. The other thing is that the government, the Republican government of Spain, had a lot of socialists and communists in it. And they didn't want to say that they were supporting the far left. And there were also, I'll leave it there. Many people in the United States, Britain, and throughout the world, throughout the West, just thought that the fight in Spain was their fight. So they formed volunteer organizations, Canada, in Great Britain, and the United States. In the United States, they were called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, named after the President Abraham Lincoln. So they left work, and actually we have over 100 Michiganders who left their homes, many from Detroit, right down the street. Actually, 7 students from Wayne State left their studies and went to go fight fascism in Spain. Not all of them came back. And actually, I'll answer your question in a minute, but let me just make a plug here. The legacy of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, so they lost, right? Fascism won. Fascism stayed in Spain through the 1970s. But people thought that the fight against fascism was a fight against racism, a fight against injustice, and they continued on, right? Be it in World War II, back in the States, or fighting in other places of the world. So I'm part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive, which is the archive is housed in New York, and it's an organization that continues the memory of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and also promotes social justice and human rights. So we have an annual Human Rights Award, which is wonderful. We have teaching institutes that talk about human rights, that talk about the Spanish Civil War, how to read historical documents. Closer to home at Wayne State has a scholarship, a $1,000 scholarship, that recognizes students who engage in social activism and work to promote peace. We are the only university in the world, as far as I know, that has a scholarship in the name of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And that is from veterans of the war who lived in the Spanish Civil War, who lived in Detroit, who came together 39 years ago, to fund this scholarship. They brought in the great folk singer Pete Seeger, who you might not have heard of. He's a late great folk singer who gave a concert, and that brought in a lot of money. And we've been able to fund and recognize great works by students. So everyone should apply for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, or the Veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Scholarship. Okay, so there's my introduction. Your question was that not intervention into another conflict? It is. Let me ask. So what's the implication of that?
I'm just wondering, where do we draw the line?
That's a really great question.
It seems obvious, like looking back and historically, it seems like obvious, like, sure, we should have done it.
Well, that's it. I mean, are there times when you see a fight going on elsewhere that you feel should be your own? At what time should you stand up and intervene? What time do you say that that's not my fight? I think a lot of people saw fascism as a real international threat to democracy, to equality, fighting against racism, anti-Semitism, and they thought that it must be stopped then before it went on. You can talk about kind of the ideas of international order not to intervene in civil wars, but that's kind of come later. That's a really great question. I don't have a good answer. These are individual citizens. They weren't states. But at what point do citizens act because your states won't? Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't have a good answer.
It's probably an ethical question. I mean,
that's exactly it.
There's no right or wrong.
See. I mean, for me, I actually do think that there's a right and wrong. I think that it was that the United States was in the wrong. If we can actually say, I don't like to give kind of moral equivalents, kind of moral judgments about history. As a historian, I look at documents and I talk about the why. But as a citizen, I would say that the United States and other powers, all other powers except for Mexico and the Soviet Union, made a mistake by not fighting fascism, and going beyond that to actually allowing some of their corporations to actually fund and supply the fascists, Franco's army in Spain. So.
Okay, I think with that
Yeah, how's that for my soapbox?
We go into our off-topic, segment. Jake, what do we have today for our dessert?
Okay, so our sponsor for this show, we lost all our previous sponsors with the last show, so we had to get some new ones. And
what'd you do?
We did a large hit piece on, I believe it was on Tim Hortons, and it was a large legal fiasco. So, from Saunders Kitchen to your table, Saunders, established 1875, chocolate fudge bumpy cake. They're the fine chocolatiers over at Saunders, and we commend them for that. So, we're going to try a piece. All of us are going to get a piece of this.
Yum.
Saunders bumpy cake. And Ruben, has anyone texted in with any questions?
Yeah, we actually have one.
Wow.
This one is from Ashley. This is, what is your favorite event in Russian history? Professor Retish.
Favorite event? Gosh, that's a good question. Favorite event? I love the spring of 1917 because... So this was right after the overthrow of the Tsar, and just because when you read the documents, you see the joy and the emotion kind of spilling off the page. People crying, people wearing red armbands. Easter that year was seen with new significance because they saw Russia as being renewed. So that's pretty amazing. I mean, there are some other great stories of Russian history. So the great stories of the Mongol invasion when they were trying to kind of bring the Russian principalities in line. They would take those who opposed them and they would tie them up, put them on the ground, and then have they would put a board over them and have a banquet on them and crush them slowly. That's not exactly,
that sounds really fun.
Yeah, I thought that kind of gets in the mood for bumpy cake. Yeah, so that's just, I mean, those are stories just that get my students' interest. But it's really the spring of 1917 is a wonderful time to read. So
sounds like it should be a song. Spring of...
Yeah, it should. It should.
Well, just so that everyone knows again, we are taking questions for Professor Retish. The phone number to text in is 313-451-2909. Jake, it seems like you're having a little bit of trouble there.
That's the song.
Yeah, we didn't get a sponsorship from plastic forks, or from plastic knives, so we had these plastic forks for today's show.
So aren't all the students on spring break right now? I mean, aren't they
technically
driving to Florida or
Tampa? I think it starts on Monday, actually.
Okay.
Officially.
Okay.
Yeah. But they're not going to miss this show.
Yeah, that's true.
They're probably tuning in their cars.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, we got another one. This one, it doesn't say who the name is, but who is your favorite Russian? And why?
I have a lot of friends in Russia who are some of my very favorites. I don't have a good answer there.
All of them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have a good answer there. I'll say this. I love following tennis, and when I was growing up, I followed some of the Russian tennis stars, the late Soviet tennis stars, and there was one. Actually, she's Belarusian, Natasha Zvereva, who was really popular in the 1980s, and she got to the Grand Slam, got to the French Open final before getting beat by Steffi Graf. She was really remarkable because she was one of the first athletes that kind of stood up against the Soviet Union. She won a check at one of these tournaments, and she spoke publicly and said that the check that she had received meant nothing to her because she would just have to turn it over to her minders. And so that was really remarkable. It was fun to watch her play tennis, but it was also great to see this protest. I don't know if she's my favorite. I've never met her. So, and then the other Russian tennis players of the 80s and 90s were also pretty extraordinary. So that's not a really good historical question. But yeah.
All right. We have another question from Tom Hayes.
Yeah.
He
Hey, Tom.
he's tuning in from a plane. He says.
Wow.
Are you planning on teaching any new Russian history courses?
I'll teach if students want a specific Russian history course. Let me know. I am planning one of the history of post-Soviet Russia. That was an idea from, I think, a student. So that would basically be Yeltsin, 1991 to the present. And I have another one in the works of a history of Russia and Eurasia. That's kind of a survey course that looks not only at Russia, but so there's this idea of Eurasia as kind of Central Asia, and looking at kind of the Silk Road and how that ties in to Russia. That is, Russia shouldn't just be seen as a northern country, but kind of tied all the way down into lower Central Asia. So those are two ideas. But if anyone else has ideas, let me know. If people will enroll, I'll teach it.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe.
Jake, I think you had a new segment introduction.
You have a new segment that we're going to bring into the show. We've all heard of celebrities read mean tweets, seen on shows like Jimmy Kimmel and I think some other late night shows. But we've got professors read strange Rate My Professor reviews. So we've got a couple here for you to read, give you a little bit of a chance to defend yourself or explain yourself. So
That's really funny.
straight from the top, from July 4th of 2005.
Oh, all right. Oh, jeez. That's really funny. All right. Should I say it tongue in cheek then, like the stars?
For sure.
Okay. So this is from 2005. A rising star in academia. For a hippie, he is an excellent teacher. He challenges his students to engage in discussion and uses a wide variety of tools to keep his class very interesting. The whole hair thing tops it off. Perhaps the only thing he might improve is cutting off those who babble about unrelated materials and digressions in discussion. Can I defend myself, or do I have to read all of them?
No, you
first?
can do it.
Go ahead.
All right, so yeah, I guess I wouldn't say I'm a hippie. That's nor am I a rising star in academia. For a hippie, yeah, I don't say groovy or I don't have the students listen to. So I do a history, the world since 1945, and for that I talk about 1968. And I think I play some Elvis Presley and the Beatles, but I don't subject my students to, I don't know, Led Zeppelin or anything. I guess it's not really hippie music. I don't have beads. I don't wear flowing robes. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I do let students babble. Yeah, because sometimes I enjoy that. All right, so point made. Also from 2005. Funny guy, looks like he's right out of the 1970s and has the longest hair at Wayne State.
Is that fact checked? True.
That cannot be. I think my colleague in history has longer hair. I have a colleague in history with longer hair. I used to have long hair. Now my hair is longish. I used to have it all the way down my back.
Dang.
And that's hard to maintain. So I haven't. This is actually a funny story. This has nothing to do with the rate my professor thing, but you asked for a funny thing that happened in the 1990s. So here I was I'll tell you two funny stories that have nothing to do with this. So there I was in provincial Russia in the 90s, and I was getting on a bus, a municipal bus, or I was waiting for a bus, and a grandmother, a babushka, came up to me, said, "Are you a girl or a boy?" Because I had long hair then, but I felt like I had kind of a scruffy face. So, I mean, what are you supposed to say? Another time, a lot of Russians there's the Russian Orthodox Church, and the priests there are usually dressed in black gowns, and then they also have long hair and a beard, right? It's kind of part of the ensemble. And so I was waiting for a train, and some drunk he wanted to pull me over because he was like, "Brother, let me confess my sins," because he thought I was a priest, and I am not. So
Did you hear him out?
no, I didn't. I think I said I had to get on the train. Okay, wait, can I finish? So good teacher, motivated and passionate, but the readings are time-consuming. While this class is just a mere gen ed requirement. Overall good teacher. Will help anyone. I will help anyone, and my readings are time-consuming. I don't know. I mean, shouldn't they be?
I think so for a topic or subject like history. I think you should read a lot.
Yeah, I try not to give my students readings that they don't need to, but, reading's not a bad thing. Okay. So this is from 2006. I have never before seen a more beautiful human being in my life. Oh, that's the kindest statement. I hope, gosh. They need to get out more. Yeah. I wonder who wrote that.
Jake, was that you?
Yeah, was that you who put that there?
Back in 06, I was how I spent my time.
Yeah.
Jeez. In 2006, I was a lot younger.
Well, I think that concludes our show for today. We want to thank all our listeners.
Our listener?
We want to thank Professor Retish for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for stopping by.
Yeah.
And we want to take a sec to thank our engineer, Sal. Thank you, Sal. All right.
All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.